Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Education Forum being hosted by Contrarian Boston. We are the city's leading independent news source with our host. And with that, let me turn it over to our host, Scott Van Voris. He is the editor and founder of the Contrarian Boston and reporting news daily that you won't read anywhere else.
Thanks, Jen. We're here today with a great panel of experts here to talk about some of the challenges facing education in Massachusetts. We have, declining test scores, dropping enrollment, frustrated staff, teachers threatening to strike. The MCAS graduation requirement was eliminated, so districts are scrambling now to try to figure out what their standards will be. And amid it all, at least nationally and maybe even locally, media coverage of education has been shrinking because newspapers are shrinking. Independent and mainstream news outlets have lost education reporters or had to scale back. So here today with a great panel of experts. We have Anna Nolan, Superintendent of Schools in Newton, Will Austin, publisher of the Boston Focus newsletter, which covers really digs deep into education statistics and trends. Alexander Russo, who is editor of The Grade, which is another great independent media outlet that covers media coverage of education and the trends there. And Mary Tamer, founder and executive director of Mass Potential, who's doing some great work on literacy reform. So I want to kick things off with Anna with a question for you. And as we all know, MCAS graduation requirement was eliminated through a ballot question, and districts have been scrambling to figure out, well, what will their standards be if students aren't required to pass the MCAS to graduate? What should they be required to do? I'm wondering, how's Newton dealing with that? How are you dealing with the change in what are you looking at for your own graduation standards at this point?
Thank you for having me. In Metro West, and I've been in Metro West as a school leader for about 30 years, and as a superintendent in 2 districts in Metro West for the last 10 or 12. I don't think that for some districts, MCAS is not an end-all be-all. It is designed to be an assessment of the state standards and mastery of what was put out in the Massachusetts state standards. So I always call it with teachers and parents like a what did we teach and how did they learn it kind of assessment. So it's one tool in a thriving district's repertoire for how we know how students are doing. In any district that I lead, we also implement skill-based math and ELA benchmark assessments. And because teachers should be at the heart of what we do in this business, we also have teacher-curated common assessments that we say, okay, our teachers are saying these are the really important pieces of the curriculum from their perspective, and we want to see how is everyone doing on the thing our teachers said was the most important. Now, of course, that's triangulated to the benchmark and to MCAS and to state standards, if you will. So in Newton, we are at emerging states on that. This is my 3rd year here. So we have benchmark assessments, grades K to 9, 3 times a year. We still have the MCAS, which we can still use to understand what's going on for our students. And we are in the process of developing through curriculum reviews what our teachers are going to identify as common assessments. And then I feel like our portfolio will be complete. Really tricky timing with the decisions that the state has made in terms of MCAS, but we still have to take it so we can still use the data to our advantage. Relative to graduation requirements, I think we're all kind of just holding our breath and waiting for the state graduation council to tell us what it actually all means. The end of course assessment discussion has really ripped through the superintendent community because what is that going to mean? Does that mean that the work I'm doing with my teachers right now to co-craft strong assessment for our district is going to fly out the window because the state is going to tell us what those will be? We don't know. So I'm in a weird moment of trying to move the district forward in a way that gives families and kids an understanding of how everyone's doing, allows me to plan, allows teachers to feel more effective, and we're waiting. So that's where we are. The graduation requirements, I think, is a whole other conversation because that too is coming out of this statewide graduation council. And there's huge variance across the state for what is allowed for graduation requirements. So I welcome that conversation. I just need it to have happened yesterday.
Timing issue here, and we're already heading towards the spring and another class that'll be graduating. Does it have a practical effect, or are you just like it's okay for now, but you may have to redo things in terms of the requirements when the state finally gets around to kind of coming out with their final recommendations?
Yeah, are some massive impacts across the state, perhaps not as great in Newton as in other areas. But for example, students from last year and this year, we're changing the game mid-course for them. Their high school career is about to be over, and suddenly they have a year to address this new situation. So that's been tremendously hard, especially for our transfer students and students for whom English is not their first language. To expect them to demonstrate coursework and end of course mastery for ninth and 10th grade science, math, and English language arts is a tall order. So we are doing everything that we can to accelerate that. Unfortunately, the state regs also say this little clause like superintendents can just like say what happens in extenuating circumstances. So I'm certainly receiving some petitioning like, can't you just let this kid graduate? But we want our Newton diploma to stand for something, and we
Sure.
want to be sure that young people have what they need to be productive citizens. So there is definitely an impact. And you can imagine across the range of types of schools, urban schools in particular in our state, it's a real difficulty.
And it sounds like you're hearing from other superintendents as well. They're all struggling with the same issue, or
Oh, we were absolutely overwhelmed in this past year by that. There was no sort of state strategy on the competency determination and so every district had to scramble and do it. And then there were some new CTE pathways and CTE votes and policies that had to be created without any model policies from the state. So it felt like COVID all over again, 300 and some odd districts trying to
wow.
create some outcome. So I know, the governor and the secretary of education are trying with these graduation councils to come up with what's next, but there were some things that were cart before the horse.
Sure. Mary, you've been doing a lot of great work on literacy reform, and it's really been very even shocking the decline in reading comprehension among third graders and elementary school kids. I can see it in my own school district, and kids are seemingly struggling or struggling even as they get into high school, still struggling with issues with reading and reading comprehension. Of course, it makes you wonder, how did this happen? We have a state that have been teaching reading for hundreds of years. It was the state with the first public schools. People have been learning how to read since, for thousands of years. How could this have happened? So, Mary, what's the status of some of the literacy reform legislation on Beacon Hill? What's been passed? What is pending?
Yeah, no, thanks, Scott. We had, this is the second filing of what we refer to as the Right to Read bill here in Massachusetts. And it was back in October. We had a unanimous vote in the House. It was 155-0 in favor of this bill. And now that bill is with the Senate. And we, certainly hope that the Senate members will be taking up the bill soon. That will then put us in a place where we have a House version of the bill and a Senate version of the bill, which not unusual. And so then the process will be that members of the House, members of the Senate go into conference committee, and then we'll work out the differences in the two bills and come up with a final product, we hope by spring, and then would anticipate a full vote. And so I think it is surprising because one of the narratives that we're always hearing about Massachusetts is we're number one, we're number one. And for the folks that I work with, and I think it was our friends at Ed Trust Massachusetts who wrote a report years ago called Number One for Some, because yes, we're number one, but I believe we're number two when it comes to how large the gaps are, whether from our highest performers to our lowest performers. And if you look at literacy data, and I'm sure Dr. Nolan knows this from her own district, you can see anywhere, Scott, from a 30 to 50 percentage point gap from the highest performers to the lowest. And when it comes to literacy, though, I want to be clear that this is an issue that impacts, not only our urban areas, but some of the districts that, people move to specifically because of their schools.
Sure.
And we've had an incredible group of parents from the Lexington Public Schools who are very clear that the only reason Lexington is doing as well as they are, because they're not using research and evidence-based instruction, is because they have so many parents who are able to pay for tutoring. And some of those parents are paying for tutoring by taking money out of their 401ks, like spending significant sums of money. And then Lexington and areas like that are also the places where you see Kumon centers, because that comes at a very significant price as well. And so those places are very strategically located in some of the best neighborhoods and some of the best school districts, because those families can pay for tutoring. So even in a place like Lexington, you'll see, 60 something percent of white students are proficient in third grade. But then if you look at the low income kids in the third grade, there's a 40 percentage point difference. And that tells us those are the kids who can't pay for tutoring. And that's a school district that isn't doing right by its students.
Are we starting to see, I know the governor has been, it seems like has embraced the cause here, some initiatives. Are we starting to see it filter down into the classroom? Have there been changes, or is it some districts doing some things and other districts doing other things? Writing about this issue, I've tried to like recollect, which is very difficult. How did I learn how to read? Did we use phonics? I mean, I'm going back like what's changed here? What is it filtering down yet to the classrooms, or are we still kind of at the legislative phase?
It's a mixed bag for sure. It's about 50% of districts in Massachusetts right now that are doing the right thing. They're using research and evidence-based instruction and materials, and the other 50% aren't. And so, yes, the governor has made not only a commitment, but a financial investment in an initiative called Literacy Launch. That money is, for the most part, going toward teacher training or retraining. And so many of our teachers, depending on the colleges they went to, were not properly trained in how to teach kids how to read. That's the sad thing. We have a teacher in our group who shared that she graduated from Leslie, who will not walk away from debunked teaching practices. And she said, I've graduated, I've got $150,000 in loans, and I'm in the classroom and I don't know how to teach kids how to read because I wasn't taught how to teach kids how to read. We only have 3 institutions of higher ed in the state of Massachusetts who are properly teaching our pre-service teachers how to teach kids how to read. So this is an issue from early ed all the way up to higher ed, Scott, and we can't underestimate, like we are setting teachers up for failure and no one deserves that. And so what we're seeing though, and the Department of Ed is telling us this, when these slots open up, when the literacy launch money is going into, like they trained 600 teachers last summer at Fort Devens. The first 150 spots were gone within 2 or 3 hours.
Wow.
The 600 spots were gone within 3 days. And so teachers in the classrooms are clamoring to do right by their kids. We need to give them those opportunities to be retrained because their colleges didn't necessarily prepare them to teach kids how to read.
Now, just being a little devil's advocate here and turning things around, one thing I've also wondered is, well, what role has social media played, the rise of cell phones, all the distractions? Then you had the pandemic and kids were doing homeschooling effectively. And I'll tell you, that was an interesting experiment from my own perspective of my own kids. I mean, had one kid who thought this was great and did everything and managed to get a 3-day week, and another kid who couldn't even find where he was supposed to be at every day. But how much of the decline in reading scores has to do with just kids kids are just on their cell phones. They're on they're doing stuff. They're just not reading, and you would have some sort of decline anyway. I mean, and how do we deal? Is that a factor too?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question we live in a distracted world, and I say this as an adult. I mean, we're all too tethered to our phones as far as I'm concerned. So I think there's multiple factors that are part of what we're seeing in schools right now, Scott. Like, absolutely, it's probably a topic for another day. That being said, it was, say, 30 some odd years ago when Lucy Calkins and Fontes and Pinnell basically went, into the world to say, and I'm oversimplifying here, but we've built a better mousetrap. We know we've come up with a way to teach kids how to read that is so much better than how we've been teaching kids how to read. And so I highly recommend the Sold a Story podcast, which will go into far greater detail about how we got to where we are. But for as much as folks want to blame the pandemic, we know from NAEP scores, from MCAS scores, we have been on this downward trajectory now for more than a dozen years. At the same time, states like Mississippi have been going up. And so for those of us that love charts and love looking at data, in 2028, if Massachusetts continues going down and Mississippi continues going up, we will meet in 2028. Mississippi, for the record, has double the poverty rate of a state like Massachusetts, and they spend less than half of what we do on educating children. And so we really need to start doing the right thing, and that includes using research and evidence-based materials and research and evidence-based instruction. That is a huge part of the solution, as well as making sure that all of our teachers are being properly trained and supported along the way in how to do this work.
Thanks, Mary. Will, you read a great newsletter, Boston Focus. You're really digging into some of these trends and issues that we've been talking about. What's happening? What are you seeing with scores in Boston and some of the big districts, and how does it match up with the rest of the state?
Well, thanks for that question, Scott. Thanks for having me. It's nice to join everyone on the
Thank you.
panel and everyone out there. We can't say, I hope your lunch is good. I hope you're having, a nice multitask moment as we speak here. So I think most times when you see any kind of data or changes in public policy, there's a long-term set of inputs and then there's a shorter term set of inputs. I think the piece that often gets missed, and I think Mary did a great job of kind of explaining how declines, have happened over a period of time. One kind of factor that gets missed a lot is the fact that the MCAS and state standards adjusted in Massachusetts in 2019, right? This is something that someone like Dr. Nolan would know, is that the 3th grade MCAS and the 10th grade MCAS, to put it simply, got harder. Like, it was more difficult to get a proficient score. And so a lot of times when folks are looking at assessment data over time and how it's changed, folks kind of miss that step that Massachusetts, I think, took kind of like the bold step to say, we're gonna raise the bar for everybody. And sometimes when you raise the bar, you get lower scores. So that's just something to keep in context when you think about all these things. And then I'd say, secondly, then you can talk more about COVID interruption, social media, those other pieces, but those are one of the short-term pieces. The long-term pieces that we kind of changed in standards and expected more from kids, and we have not yet figured out a way to help more kids meet that bar at scale across the state.
And what districts are performing better than others? What are you seeing in terms of maybe meeting those expectations, or at least kind of trying to stabilize or reverse those trends?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there's not as much good news as you would like. I mean, I would say that the data that Mary's referencing with NAEP more or less matches how you've seen in Massachusetts. And if we were to go back to 2019 and that changing of standards and then follow that by the pandemic, the trend that you see is that the gaps between our high-income students, our high-performing students, and by race have increased, that those gaps have actually gotten bigger. There was a long period of time where there was some hope that those gaps, and data indicating that those gaps were starting to shrink. And again, that combination of standards and then the interruption of the pandemic and things that followed have actually made those things more difficult. I would say that a lot of times there's an emphasis, and this is something else to talk about, is that there's a certain frame and narrative in the media about how schools are doing and the problems they have. But the way I tend to think about it a little more generally is that within all that noise, there are good schools, right? And within Boston, even though it continues to struggle systemically, there are 30, 40, 50 schools that have great academic outcomes for kids and have high demand from families. What we haven't ever figured out in Massachusetts or this country is how we replicate that or scale that to more folks. Whether or not you have access to a good school in Massachusetts really resides on luck or whether or not you can afford to buy a house somewhere. And we really haven't changed that recently.
Yeah, no, that's really a great point. I mean, so much of it is based on it does seem to be based on the wealth of the community and the resources and the parents who could, as has been referenced here, who are maybe have the resources to pay for tutoring or extra help for their kids. So that's a big factor. It's good to hear, as you're saying, in a big picture, there's some real bright spots as well. And the issue is how do you, and I think I just following these debates, I'm not hardly an expert in it, but that seems like that's been an issue for over the decades, right?
Well, and if I can just make one more broad point about that, there is a bit of a fault in the way that we in America think about education, think about educators. We tend to be very individualistic
Sure.
and say that this school is remarkable because this person and this leader is so good and this teacher is so good and everyone thinking of Robin Williams up on the desk and all that other stuff. And we kind of accept in America that we'll accept variance, that you might be lucky enough to have a great principal, a great set of teachers, and you do great. And if you don't get that, tough luck. Whereas other countries have a much more systemic and frankly kind of socialist system around how they manage teacher and educator quality.
Sure. Yeah, right. Right. No, that's really interesting. It is there's a kind of myth of the of maybe not a myth. I mean, we all have had great teachers, but there's going to be variance, and if you can't just depend upon, having a Robin Williams, know, teach your class or but
Scott, I would just say to you, the
yeah,
research says that collective teacher team efficacy is actually where it's at. So, I think it would be a
sure.
hard sell to many American school systems to be like, let's do that thing that the other countries do, even though there's proof of concept there.
Right.
But there is ample research that if you feed the teams, you reduce teacher burnout, you create extensive expertise,
Interesting.
and you create a systematic data and review cycle that pushes people to be stronger together. And I think that's where public schools really need to leverage. That's where I put my investment for my district.
Right. No, that is really interesting. And it is, yeah, it is sort of like politically. I mean, unfortunately, when we don't like to, well, at least some part of the strong part doesn't want to look to any other countries because it feels like whatever that you're trying something different or strange or that what's wrong with what we're with our own country. So it's a tough political issue. Alexander, you read a great you have a great publication, The Grade, and you're covering something that I don't think anybody else is covering, which is how the media covers education, which is such a critical area. And what trends are you seeing there? Has it been impacted? Are the amount of coverage, the number of reporters out there, has it been impacted by what we've seen with newspapers and local newspapers, which many of them are really struggling?
Thanks, Scott, and great to be here with everybody. The idea behind the grade is a newsletter and now a podcast by education journalists for education journalists. There are about 2,000 people nationwide who are full-time mainstream education reporters or editors, and another number of growing independent, non-traditional journalists, parents, advocates, community members, including some of the people here. And the idea is that the public's understanding and elected official and policymaker understanding of what's going on in schools often comes through the media, and the ability to make decisions and to take action comes in part through this bank shot. And so what I see in Boston and the Boston area, which is so fascinating, and I've had the privilege of talking to some of you and other folks, Ross Wilson from the Shaw Foundation, I talked to him earlier this week, Dan Kennedy from Media Nation. What's interesting about Boston is that it is like some other places, Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, where the problem isn't so much a lack of firepower, a lack of educational reporters and editors or ed teams. Relatively speaking, there's still a goodly set of people covering schools. Maybe not as much as there were 20 or 30 years ago, but certainly better than your average bear. But sometimes there's a lack of urgency or consistency. And I hate to see that when it happens, and I call it out when I can. The the issue that I see is that mainstream news organizations, the Boston Globe's the obvious contender here, do a great work when they dive deep into a topic, but oftentimes they don't stay on the topic. And so there's a great power to the occasional piece. Sometimes everyone gets things wrong as well. We've all dealt with that. But there's not a drum beat, the kind of drum beats that you'd want week to week, month to month. And so it's very easy for attention to get shifted. There are lots of things going on in Boston and the Boston area that are important. Enrollment declines, the literacy issues. Talk to Ross and he'll talk to you about the transportation spending issues. I talked to Renee Wilkinson. We talked a lot about school closures and consolidations. There's a lot going on. And I just wish that there were more frequent and more robust stories coming out, given the resources that are available.
That's interesting. And not to shift a little bit to the national, shift the focus nationally, but you said 2,000 education reporters. How does that compare over time? Do you know? Do you have any stats, or is that just really hard to track?
How does what compare over time? Sorry, I couldn't
Oh,
hear
sorry.
you.
Yeah, I think you mentioned there's like 2,000 education reporters
You know,
across the country.
education has not suffered the same steep decline that other beats and general journalism has, in part because of some innovations, including something that started 5 or 10 years ago called Report for America.
Oh,
Remember,
that's right. Yeah.
I remember when Report for America came along and the guy who co-founded it said, "Hey, we're going to call it Report for America." I said, "Are you sure you want to do that? This is sort of fraught language, given where school reform is and where Teach for America was at the time." He said, "Oh, don't worry about that. It's going to be fine." And it has been. Now, 5 or 10 generations of young and early career journalists have been placed, oftentimes as education reporters, and luckily they get to stay. I'm not saying that the teams are as big as they used to be. I'm not saying that there are external threats or external circumstances that make being a journalist very hard. But there are also enormous ways in which it's easier to get good information out into the world without being a capital J journalist or working in a traditional newsroom. And Scott, you and Will both have demonstrated some of that. There's some amazing non-traditional journalism going on. The ability to get information out is accelerated, and we've had these little glimpses of in Boston and in other places, glimpses of what education journalism could be. I'd like to say, let's not just rescue journalism, let's also fix it. I really appreciated the work that the Emancipator did when it was in Boston. I don't know if you all remember, but they did some great work before they moved south, including most notably a really dramatically different take on the anniversary of the Boston busing
Right.
issue. If you put their stories, the Emancipator put out 4 or 5 stories compared to the Globe and everyone else's stories, you'd see that the way that some of the people who were there and some of the communities that were most directly affected felt was very, very different than what we're taught in the textbooks. And we need more of that fearless and independent coverage, because otherwise it just ends up being what administrators have to say, what experts have to say, what advocates have to say. No offense to all those people, but the lives that are directly affected are parents and kids and communities.
Yeah, no, those are really great points. And there's also there's starting to be in the Boston area, and I think some other cities, nonprofit news startups. I know in Newton, I think there are two now, two papers, not papers, using that term, but online news sites. Marblehead, I think Marblehead is two.
Mhm.
I would guess there are probably maybe a couple dozen now, maybe 30 around the Boston area, if I'm
Mhm.
counting. There's one in Needham. Um, so that's starting to fill the role of and they are doing more in-depth or reporting on even traditional things like school budgets and initiatives and school building projects that but I think where the fall I guess when I see in the Boston area there's been a huge fall off in the suburbs. A lot of those papers are owned by Gannett, and Gannett is just even if they're alive they don't have any reporters. I know learning, when I started off as a reporter, that was a big part of the job. Like you're covering these small towns, you were basically an education reporter. You go to all the school board meetings and you do profiles and you talk to teachers and you get an understanding of what the issues are. And I'm pretty sure that's at least with the corporate-owned papers that it's not really happening that way anymore. It just
The
they don't
the
have the
the
staff.
silver lining, and maybe this relates to the future of the world that we're all going to inhabit, and the young people are going to inhabit. It is much easier to record, scoop up the content of a school board meeting, and present it to the world than it used to be. And there are a lot of folks doing that. And then there are these sort of supplemental analytic efforts, like last night at school committee, um,
Yes,
which, by the way, the Globe should license that and distribute that, right? There's just
sure.
no reason that the Globe doesn't do that. There are lots of ways that people can grab up and present information that weren't available before.
Yeah, that's an excellent podcast. I mean, they take it as if almost as if it were, it makes it more interesting. Like it's a school board meeting is like game day or something, and here's what happened, and it's very interesting. I mean, I don't know, probably some superintendents would be like, oh, I don't know at that, but probably be good to have that attention, right?
It would be because what gets the attention now, like to your point about no more small reporters, like I used to know those people and like love them,
Sure,
hate them, like whatever side of it we were on. We weren't getting the soundbite stuff now. It's only the controversies that get amplified, right? So if I were to read about my school district from these local papers, I'm not sure I would really recognize it, right? It's sort of
interesting.
like this controversy, this big issue, a lot of parents screaming about this. That's not the totality of the teacher voice or the union voice or the administrator voice. So it's a tough time for that.
I think the issue
Yeah,
here, sorry to interrupt, but I think the issue here is that the journalists have been chasing social media.
Mm.
And so even publications that used to be a little bit more information based now feel like they have to chase and shout like everyone else. I think there's a lane for journalism uh, uh, where calm, accurate information and analysis will be valued. But I think that all too much of it has gone for the tabloidification of traditional journalism.
right. Well, and that social media, I mean, it's certainly played a role in that, and in our politics and how we debate all issues, education, politics, and it gets very heated very quickly online anyway. And I think it filters out into unfortunately, to the real world. Um, another issue, of course, everybody's dealing with, and I think there's been a couple good stories. A little bit of story on this, and a couple other outlets on enrollment declines, which is starting to really pick up. And I know, Anna, I was reading that maybe Newton was going to accept students from other districts, or was looking at that, or is that just something that just was thrown out there? And I thought that was really
Well,
interesting.
the superintendent thought that was a good idea I mean, I've been a school choice district in my other districts at times when the enrollment had dips. Nationally, I just left a national superintendent webinar on enrollment and strategic budgeting. Like everyone is going to experience enrollment declines in the United States. Massachusetts affords an option for districts to sort of plug holes when they see that. Some districts like it, some don't. More have increasingly not. And so far, Newton, in my time here, has been like a no, don't suggest that. But I'm going to keep suggesting it because my job is to make sure that we have the resources that we need. And this is one other way that the state affords them. So so it's a no, actually, Scott. They're not interested so far in my little plan.
Well, I think it's a really interesting idea. How would it work? In like the public school setting, would parents or students apply, or how would
Yeah,
it work?
it's a statewide, it's enshrined in state statute.
Hmm.
School choice is a lottery-based program where districts say, these are the available seats in the grades that we think we can handle it. And you open it only for that scope. And there's an application process. It is a complete lottery. You pull it out of a hat. And once you take that student, you have them for the entire rest of their career and full stop and all their needs. And they become as if they are a student from your district. There is a reimbursement from the sending district. So you do receive money for this process. But it does open some cans of worms, right? So you take a student and you have to take them with anything that they need, which can be difficult. And folks who generally apply for school choice for some reason aren't loving their current place. And there's lots of reasons for that, but sometimes it's because the district cannot accommodate their needs, which means that high needs folks tend to be in the school choice lottery, which is a deeper need than to be met by the receiving district.
Hmm. Will, what are you seeing with enrollment trends? And I know Boston had a tick up. I think maybe through immigration and then that's like gone down again. It looks like the latest figures showed another decline.
Yeah.
What are you seeing in Boston and around the state in terms of enrollment?
Yeah, and again, this kind of fits in the category of, long term, short term, and big small. Like long term, Massachusetts and Boston have been in a process of enrollment decline going back 2 decades. And a lot of that is due to very, large macroeconomic trends outside of the control of Dr. Nolan, the principals in the district, and teachers. Housing costs, affordability, birth rates. Massachusetts, it's great that so many of our folks are educated with bachelor degrees and PhDs. Guess what? Those folks don't have as many kids. So there's all these different factors that have been bearing down on us as having less kids. And Massachusetts has 100,000 fewer school age kids than they did about 15, 20 years ago.
Oh,
And so
wow.
it's a general Massachusetts problem. It's also just, frankly, an American problem. By 2030, our replacement rate will be zero, which means there'll be as many deaths as there are births every year. So this is like a larger problem of like capitalism, which we will not
Sure.
solve in this webinar. What does that mean for Boston in specific? So Boston is feeling those same trends, but feeling them in a more extreme way because it is that much less affordable to be here, that much more difficult of a school choice system to navigate, and the immigration, which you referenced, Scott. And so there was a pretty steep decline in the past year in enrollment in Boston from past years. And frankly, we've seen this play before. That's what happened from 2016 to 2020 during the first Trump administration, because of course immigration slowed down then. What does this mean? I mean, if you scan through the news every day, like people like I do, all you see across different cities and towns across Massachusetts is budget issues. And part of that is that you have, less funding coming in because you have less kids, but also because you have the same amount of money spread across more widely. And so when people talk about facilities closing, consolidating, and all this other stuff, it's not really about a cost, it's about an opportunity cost. Like we could still have as many teachers as we do and have less kids. You just would have lower ratios, and that might mean kids learn more, and that sounds great if that's your actual strategy and the actual outcomes. But instead, what we're doing is we're kind of sleepwalking through this, where we're having fewer and fewer kids, but adding more and more staff, but not necessarily seeing new programs or better results.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting.
I would
Uh,
love to weigh in,
yeah,
Scott,
hi, Mary. Yep.
as a former school committee
School committee
member.
member, yeah.
I think that is, I remember it was my first year in the Boston School Committee in 2010 under Mayor Menino when I was told there was a slate of school closures that had been presented, I think my first month, on the job. And at the time, I remember our CFO telling me, because I wanted to understand the issue better, and he said, well, think of it, when we talk about excess capacity, Mary, he said it is costing us 25 to 35 million dollars a year. This was in 2010 to basically cover the fixed costs of having classrooms that were half empty. And that cost has only risen with time. I think, they've moved away from weighted student funding. And frankly, I believe one of the reasons why is because it's not as easy for us right now to track, like, what are they paying to cover the cost of those empty seats? Because we have high schools that under the teacher contract should have, 34 kids in a classroom, and though there's only 13 kids in a class, but to Will's point, we are not seeing better outcomes. Some teachers love having only 13 kids. That's like a private school ratio right there.
Sure.
But we are not seeing better outcomes for students. I mean, the reading rates, the math rates in Boston are atrocious. And this is a problem that has been in place for a very long time, and we're still not addressing it. And at this point, we've probably spent, correct me if I'm wrong, Will Austin, what, $250 million on empty seats since, I mean, this is crazy. We could have early education for every kid in Boston. We could have like literacy coaches in every school. I mean, it is a ridiculous amount of money to be flushing down the toilet every year because we won't close schools.
Yeah, it's such a and it's not been the current mayor is struggling with it, Mayor Wu. As you mentioned, Mayor Menino was working on this issue, Mayor Walsh. It's I guess the politics of it, right, are difficult, right? Because anytime you propose to close a school, you get a group of really angry parents who
Well,
then
I would just add, it's not just the politics, it's also the economics. And I always make this comment and preface by
yes,
saying that I am the son of a retired Boston firefighter and a union nurse. Closing schools without reducing staff does not solve the problem. Because the
sure,
cost isn't the gas for the building. The
okay,
cost
yeah.
isn't the one secretary in the building. The cost for the system is that you have significantly more labor than you do relative to the students. And so if you're not reducing force as you close buildings, you're not solving your budget problems. Not saying they should do that. I'm just saying if they want to solve their budget problems, that's what it requires.
Right, that you need to have reduce some staff as well, and that's difficult to do. Getting to the, I guess, contract negotiations and it can be tough, but it's been a discussion for years now how to right size the Boston district, and it is it's tough to see all that money, going out the window when there's such needs um, in the district, and it's such a tough subject politically for different mayors to have to deal with. Um, and what do Mary or Will? I mean, should the should is there a way to do this? Should the city just bite the bullet and just I don't know? You're going to get people upset? Just do it in a couple waves and not. Is it maybe a mistake to try to do this in dribs and drabs and it just gets dragged out and
Yeah.
yeah,
They need to do it, Scott. It's long overdue. We don't have a long range facilities plan. And one of the things that does, it creates just chaos and uncertainty for families. Like if I had a child about to enter kindergarten, right now I have no guarantee that the elementary school I send my child to will exist in 3 to 5 years. And so because we are not giving families the information that they frankly deserve, because Boston families want to invest in their local school system. Like, we do have some great schools and we have some schools that have struggled for decades. And, to Will's point, like, yes, birth rates are down and all the things, but one of the things we also know is happening in Boston, people are voting with their feet and they are leaving the school system. I've lived on the same street for 20 years. There are very few public school families on my street now versus where we were 15, 20 years ago. And that is a reflection of what people think about the school system. And so, to not do the right thing, and when this is 40% of our budget, and the fact that this isn't something that is frankly talked about at every school committee meeting, because not only should they be talking about their literacy and math rates at every single meeting, they should also be talking about when are we going to be able to reinvest in a system that is desperate for reinvestment because every school principal just got their budget in the last 5 days, which by the way is late. And also, they're all being told, number one, BPS has a hiring freeze. And number two, you have to cut your budget. And so this is what school leaders face and our teachers face on an annual basis because the grown-ups in charge won't do the right thing.
And if you want to see the opposite or an alternative reality, you can look at the District of Columbia Public Schools. They had to go through a closure process 10 or 20 years ago, um, uh, which was incredibly difficult and upsetting. But then maybe 10 years ago, people started started moving back or staying. And even the DCPS superintendent told me that they had to start hiring investigators because people from the suburbs were
Huh.
faking city addresses in order to get their kids into District of Columbia Public Schools. So there are places that have figured out a way to make the politics work. A couple have tried sort of a base commission kind of approach to get it done so there isn't this drip, drip, drip that Mary, you, and Will have described. And then you have a chance to start rebuilding and drawing parents back in or encouraging them to stay.
It does feel like the system is just kind of locked into place where it can't make the changes it needs to make without right sizing, without freeing up resources that aren't being used productively.
Mhm.
And it's really hard to, if you're
The
just trying to, sorry, pardon.
I was just going to say the politics are just absolutely brutal here, though. I mean, to be honest, if it was easy to change. It would have been changed easier. There are people who are very understandably concerned about losing their positions, and human nature is what human nature is. So I feel like there's got to be another way to water down or I mean, Chicago tried to do it in a way that actually didn't quite work. They did a sort of a sprint kind of approach,
Hmm.
and ended up discrediting the school improvement efforts for a generation.
Hmm.
So there are lots of ways to do this wrong. I just want to acknowledge that the politics are brutal.
Another startling stat seemed to be the growth in private schools especially I guess since the pandemic, maybe that there are more and more kids that are enrolled in private schools, which has got to be, I think, in Newton, it probably competition, right? Given, or in districts and suburban districts, or in Boston as well. Um, so
I'm not sure how much of that is the plural of anecdote versus data, because
okay,
the state data is not super clear on that as a trend. And part of it is
okay,
also the data collection be a little tricky because private schools, a lot of the data collection is voluntary. It's tough. Like, I mean, I've looked at this data myself, and it's very easy to hear a couple anecdotes or a couple neighborhoods.
yes,
Oh, that person moved. It's not completely clear to me. And the only other point I would make about this is that, especially in a world where folks are talking about the ESAs and things that come out of
right,
the bill, you know, independent schools in Massachusetts almost have a self-imposed cap because they have business models themselves, right?
yep,
They have facilities and they have a certain number of kids they enroll. And so it's not clear to me whether or not that industry is going to grow. It just might mean that different kids are going to them. I mean, if for
sure,
some reason Massachusetts was to volunteer and open an ESA, Roxbury Latin's not going to take 1,000 kids next year. Like that's not going to
sure.
happen. And so I don't know how much of that actually has an effect on a system level. I think it affects individuals.
I do
Right.
think districts can track these pieces, and I just want to
Yeah.
say, we have put into place and are actually seeing the trend start to reverse in Newton. We are tracking who has left, who has been with us before, and who's coming back. So,
Hmm.
two high schools, 228 folks back who have already been with us and came back during their high school years. So, I would encourage districts to track that piece because it helps us all, especially with the ESA scenario looming. I have to know what was normal and baseline before any new changes come to pass.
Right. Though that's great to hear that you're tracking that because it is a key factor, right? I mean, it's the districts have to deal with, and and certainly whether it's how much it's increased, it's as well as saying it's hard to know.
Oh,
But there's clearly something going on there.
not to maybe like make another esoteric point or something that'll
No,
never actually happen. Part of the reason why this is so difficult in Massachusetts is we have so many school districts, right?
sure.
So Massachusetts, we have about 900,000 school-aged kids in public schools. We have 351 school districts. Maryland has 1 million kids. They have 27 school districts.
Oh my God.
Now, why does that matter? Me going back to being a middle school math teacher, it's because the variations in enrollment hurt a lot when they're spread amongst 351 as opposed to 27. And so what ends up happening is that when you have these small school districts we have in Massachusetts, where the average school district size about 2,400, 2,500 kids, you lose 50 or 100 kids, you feel that in a way that you wouldn't in a kind of a county system where you have much larger enrollment. So.
Right. No, it is an unusual system, right? And there's so many local, town governments, city governments. I mean, it's 300 and what's it, 60 or it's just in all those towns of their own school districts. Some of them have teamed up, like you have Dover Sherburne or others, but it's still a huge number out there. I guess the downside of centralization, of course, is then people may feel more distant from the decision-making process. So there's always something like that. Other factors that go into that. What are each one of you looking ahead into the year? What are some of the big trends you're watching or looking at, or big things you'll be working on? And Mary, what you're immersed in the legislative front? What are you looking at? What are the things you're hoping to see happen on Beacon Hill and in the classroom, in the coming year?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're really energized about the momentum that the literacy bill has right now. We know that this is a huge step in the right direction. And starting, this bill is specific to early literacy, Scott. So we know that, once once this passes, we're going to have to go after middle school students. We know that there are too many older kids who were never properly taught how to read, and yet if I had $1 for every parent who told me, my kid was, in Belmont, no less, my kid was getting A's and B's. And it wasn't until I saw their third grade MCAS scores that I realized my child could not read. We know kids are being pushed through. And so, we're going to be closely following literacy work and making sure that children at every grade level in Massachusetts are getting what the proper instruction they need in order to be successful learners. We are closely following the graduation work here in Massachusetts because, frankly, a number of states across the country have changed their graduation standards in recent years, not necessarily for the better, and we want to be different. Massachusetts has led. I want to see Massachusetts continue to lead, and so we're doing really close following and we'll be advocating for strong, rigorous graduation standards here in Massachusetts. And the other thing that we need to start talking more about is grade inflation. And again, it's not just here in Massachusetts, but I've been going to all of the graduation council meetings that have been happening for the last year. And it was at the meeting in October, one of the teachers who is serving on the K-12 council said out loud, I need the ability to be able to fail students again. And that, I have to say, you could have heard a pin drop in the room after that. But the reality is, and I think this is fairly widespread, and we can see the disconnect between all the A's and B's that kids are getting and their test scores, which are not reflecting those A's and B's. Something is happening where some messages are being delivered that we can't fail kids anymore. And we need to give them grades that they have not earned. That is not helping anyone. And any educator who thinks they're helping a kid by pushing them through, and I hear from high school principals in Boston who have ninth graders who can't read. Like, what are we doing? Like, we need to stop the madness and we need to start teaching kids how to read and do math again.
Yeah, no, it's a great inflation. I mean, it's across the board, right? Like Harvard is, there's huge number of percentage of students that were getting, A's compared to 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And it's hard to know. It seems like it's so widespread. It's a societal shift or change. And for what it's hard to know how something like that is, how do you reverse that, or how do you, I mean, individually, I think some institutions are starting to deal with that or look at that, certainly. What are you looking at? I mean, obviously you're in the middle of the school year, so I guess you would be at some point looking ahead to the next school year, but what are some of the things you're working on or you're excited about for the coming year?
Scott, I don't know how much you respond to what's in the chat there, but I guess I do want to say that superintendents in Massachusetts are pretty collaborative. I'm one of 6 roundtable presidents. So we have networks across the state where we are frustrated by our lack of ability to share between districts and to find those synergies. I'll just give you one example, like transportation alone in Metro West is such a first mile, last mile kinds of things really get in the way of us being super creative and flexible and agile with how we address those deeper learning issues, right? So Mary says, we need more reading instruction and intervention. I agree. And parents are generally working a lot of hours and need extended time for their kids in school. We don't provide that except for fees. As someone who grew up poor, like my parents never would have been able to pay for any of that, right? So as good public schools, are we still about making sure that all kids get what they need when they need it? Or is it just, as we said, with the cottage industry and tutoring, like if you can, you get it. Otherwise, you just sort of hope for the best. Like superintendents are leveraging those conversations, but the models and funding are so traditional and they aren't keeping pace with the kinds of things that we want to do. Extend the day, start online classes for non-traditional students. I tried to do that post-COVID in my former district, and the Department of Education made it impossible for me to actually respond with things we had proof of concept for. Now, they have their own constraints, and I don't want to make them the devil, but it's these bureaucratic pieces that stop us from really uplifting the best practices from our teachers and superintendents. And that's what I want to really emphasize. So, but what do I look for in the future? I mean, we really still have in Newton some COVID recovery to do, the kinds of monies that were spent in other districts to actually do those short-term interventions, address gaps, and then release the staff were never invested in this particular district. So we're like a little behind the recovery 8 ball. So I'm really just trying to focus on our kids, listen to our teachers, and push that change agenda so that the kids can shore up those missing skills.
Thank you. Yeah, Will, what are you working on? I know in terms of projects and stories and issues.
Well, I mean, I'll take a page of what Alex was suggesting earlier. Like, I think these questions of enrollment, budget, facilities are going to continue to be things that we're going to have to wrestle with for at least the next couple of years. And so that's going to continue to like take up my attention and time and trying to how to have make sure that that can be responded to in a way that classrooms are protected. I think that's really what the core of this is. It's not some kind of intellectual exercise, that we got to do those things right so kids and educators have what they need in classrooms. On the bigger picture front, I am hopeful this year that the cell phone ban will get passed in Massachusetts. That has a little bit to do with the research of my own personal opinions, but also having been a former educator, the fact that superintendents and principals have been forced to kind of play the front line at making these policies, I think is just unfair. And so having a statewide policy, I think will at least make things easier, at least at the school level. And somewhat related and somewhat self-promoting, I'm increasingly concerned about online sports gambling, and particularly how many teenagers and particularly young boys are being trapped in that as early as 15 or 16 years old. And so I'd like to see some movement on that issue this year.
Oh yeah, no, that's fascinating. It is a really dangerous area, given how, kids and sports and their interest in it, and how gambling can, for some people, can be really destructive. And Alexander, what are you looking at? Are there any in terms of your coverage of the media coverage of education?
Things that haven't been mentioned are in the short term. I'm worried about schools over responding or responding ICE ICE onslaught. Minneapolis has made schooling in-person schooling optional again, which makes me a little bit crazy. Though I understand that I'm curious and concerned about response to the ICE effort. And then in the slightly longer term, I'm fascinated and alternately horrified about private school choice. whether some blue states will opt in or can they afford to, so to speak, not to opt in, and then some of the unregulated homeschools and schools that pop up. Parents are desperate for a quality education, and the world in which they have to go to or only think of sending their kids to the local school, that age is over. And I'd love for this new world to be one that protects the existing school system to some extent, but also protects parents from being manipulated or scammed.
Well, thank you. And any final comments or thoughts on any of these issues? Well, I appreciate everybody taking the time here. I know you're all busy, and this was a great discussion, and I really appreciate it. And we'll keep we're looking our country in Boston. We look trying to do education coverage, trying to dig into some of these issues, and there are different things that I'd like to look at more in the coming year, certainly related to some of the trends we've talked about and other issues as well. So I'm going to turn that over to Jen, who's going to talk about our next webinar coming up in April, and then we'll sign off.
Yes, thank you to all of our panelists and thank you to all of the attendees. This has been a fantastic discussion about what's happening in education. And on April 30th, we'll be taking up a similar discussion on what's happening with healthcare, with rising prices and hospitals closing and not being able to get doctor's appointments. So we'll be taking a close look at what we're facing in the state and what can be done about it. And that'll be on April 30th. And we will have, we will be sending out information to sign up for that.
Sure. Well, we'll get and we're going to be looking at putting together a panel of experts for that. So thank you very much. Good to see you all, and thank you for taking the time. And we'll be posting the video and clips from it, and also I'll be doing some stories on some of the issues there on it as well. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you.
Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye.
You too.